Hi, I'm DuEwa Frazier, and you're listening to episode 51, season 4 of Nerdacity Podcast. Follow Nerdacity Podcast on social media for news and updates. On Instagram at Nerdacity Podcast, on X, formerly Twitter, at Nerdacity Pod1, on Facebook, Nerdacity Podcast with DuEwa Facebook page, and of course, listen and subscribe across all platforms for podcasts and the YouTube channel, youtube.com/DuEwaWorld. Today's guest is author Courtney Thorsson. Courtney is an associate professor at the University of Oregon, where she teaches, studies, and writes about African American literature. Her first book, Women's Work, Nationalism, and Contemporary African American Women's Novels, argues that Toni Cade Bambara, Paule Marshall, Gloria Naylor, Ntozake Shange, and Toni Morrison reclaim and revise cultural nationalism in their novels of the 1980s and 90s. Her writing has appeared in publications including Callaloo, African American Review, MELUS, Gastronomica, Contemporary Literature, Legacy, and Public Books. Her new book, The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Changed American Culture, tells the story of how a remarkable community of Black women writers and intellectuals transformed political, literary, and academic cultures. She is a recipient of a Public Scholars Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of the research and writing of The Sisterhood. Follow Courtney's website, CourtneyThorsson.com. And I also hope you'll check out my author website as well and look at news and updates at DuEwaWorld.com. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for listening. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, DuEwa.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Glad to be talking with you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here on Nerdacity Podcast. I want to congratulate you on your new book, The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Changed American Culture.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Oh, sure. Well, please, I'd love to hear about, first off, your background and your inspiration for writing and research. I know that your first book is titled Women's Work, Nationalism, and Contemporary African American Women's Novels. And so I see your focus on Black women's writings, and it's something that I really love. And so please tell us more about your inspiration for writing and how you came to this work.
Sure. Well, I, as an undergrad many, many moons ago, was a major in both English and African American studies. So the kind of focus on Black writers was always a part of my academic path. I didn't necessarily know back then in college that I was going to turn out to be a person who devoted my life to the study of African American literature.
Mm-hmm.
But I went and had a different career. And then eventually, when I went to graduate school, really went with the aim of studying, especially contemporary African American literature. Now, the connection between women's work and the sisterhood is pretty direct, which is to say that my first book is about these novels by women in the 80s and 90s. So I look at works by Toni Cade Bambara, Paule Marshall, Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison. And I'm interested in the way those women keep on depicting and using the terms cultural nationalism way after Black nationalism is kind of out of fashion, right? And that's this period of spectacular visibility of Black women writers in
Mm-hmm.
the last few decades of the 20th century, what Mary Helen Washington calls the Black women writers Renaissance.
Mm.
And that period of time has come to seem only more spectacular to me, more particular, since my first book came out about 10 years ago. And one of the things I long suspected was that it didn't happen by accident. Of course, that period of dramatically increased visibility for Black women writers, and especially
Mm-hmm.
for novelists, came out of a bunch of behind the scenes, often invisible, collaborative labor among Black women writers, intellectuals, and scholars. So there's a kind of direct line from that
Mm-hmm.
first book to the second book in that way.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, and I see the first book was 2013 and your latest work 2024. The time in between, was that you kind of gaining new insights into Black women's writings, into their histories? What was the time in between like with your preparation for your latest book?
Well, the origin story of my book about the sisterhood reaches even further back, which is into 20 years ago in 2004 was the first time I saw the famous photo, The Sisterhood 1977. That's on the
Yes.
cover of my book. And that was in Evelyn White's biography of Alice Walker, A Life. And it was my beloved mentor, friend, teacher, Farrah Griffin, who showed that
Mm.
photo to me,
Yes.
right? And so Farrah's like, you got to see this photo, go get this book.
Right.
And I opened to that like black and white gallery of photos in the middle of Evelyn White's book, and there's this picture of beautiful, smiling women gathered around a portrait of Bessie Smith, all staring straight at the camera. And right away, I probably recognized, I would say, Ntozake Shange,
Right.
Alice Walker, Toni Morrison were probably familiar to me, maybe
Mm-hmm.
June Jordan by
June
then.
Jordan. Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be, a few more years until I learned to understand the importance, for example, of Verna May Grosvenor, the culinary writer,
Mm.
and foodways scholar and cultural force that she was. Um, so I first saw the picture in 2004, had a suspicion there was something there, kind of stuck a post-it on the picture so I could flip to it and look at it
Sure.
anytime I needed that inspiration, and started like a folder of notes just labeled the sisterhood. And
Mm-hmm.
then it was probably 2009, 2010. I'm well into working on my first book, but I had this folder on the sisterhood going. And the truly great Black feminist intellectual institution builder, writer, thinker, Cheryl Wall
Mm-hmm. Oh
knew
yes.
I was, yeah,
I
so
see I
Cheryl
see
knew.
her mentioned in the book. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, so she's, one of the important Black women scholars of that particular generation, without whom, I have no career or no book or no path or no study, right?
Sure.
So Cheryl was the one who said, so you mentioned the sisterhood to me, Courtney, and I know you're thinking about this, and I just want to tell you I was in June Jordan's papers in her archive at Harvard Radcliffe, and I saw something that I think is about the sisterhood. So
Mm.
so I reach out to the library, and that generates, they send me copies of meeting minutes and agendas.
You
And
are
so then,
kidding.
no. So then it's like, okay, so this is not just an informal get together of Black women writers, which is,
Right.
the few times the photo has appeared by 2009, 2010. Anytime you see it, it's captioned with an informal group of Black women writers. No. This was a group that had agendas, kept meeting minutes, and as I continued to do archival research over the years, I figured out that they met at least once a month for over 2 years. They took turns hosting the meeting in one another's apartments in Brooklyn and Manhattan. They kept a central Rolodex. They had a
Mm.
library. They, had a series of goals. And even at one meeting, they determined that there should be some kind of bank account, and that would get started by everyone paying dues, and dues would be $5. And I
Wow.
know for one, Audre Lorde pulled $5 out of her pocket and paid it on the spot. So it
Wow.
was, yes. It is also Cheryl Wall's wisdom to tell me a book that requires the kind of time, thinking, and archival research that this book is going to require
Yeah.
is not a book you can write until you have tenure. And
Wow.
hopefully you have some resources, some funds to help you travel and do research. And maybe if you're really lucky, you have a research assistant. Maybe you get some leave. So I had some kind of combination of a little bit of all those
Mm-hmm.
privileges, enough to get where I needed to go to write a responsible version of the story of these women.
Sure. And would you, I kept looking at, also wondering, would the Schomburg have had some of these papers, with the Schomburg being in Harlem? And was the Schomburg instrumental in
Yes,
your research? Yeah.
the Schomburg Center, branch of the New York Public Library in
Mm-hmm.
Harlem, New York. I'm sure all your listeners know that, but I can't help myself but to
No,
say
please do
it.
give the context. Yeah, I
uh,
totally.
I mean, it's the most important repository for research in Black studies broadly defined in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So, for purposes of my research, the Schomburg had lots of relevant material, but especially the Schomburg holds Michelle Wallace's papers. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Michelle Wallace is best known as author of the book Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman.
Oh yeah.
Came out in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
But Wallace has done many other things and is one of our most important and astute cultural critics, and has had, multiple books and is still writing now.
Right. Yes.
But it also is the case that one of the many great things about Michelle Wallace is that in the 70s and early 80s, when she was living in New York, participating in everything from the National Black Feminist Organization to
Mm-hmm.
interracial feminist groups to declining the invitation to attend sisterhood meetings, but kind of keeping a hand involved in their doings all the same, she
Well,
took notes on everything. So
but
any meeting
why would
yeah.
she decline? Is it because the way she politically aligned herself, or because of the writing projects that she was focused on?
I don't do conjecture and I
Got
wouldn't
you.
try to speak for her, but I would say there are a couple of things.
There are a couple
One,
of things.
the
Yeah.
sisterhood's very focused on writing and getting publication,
Publish. Mm-hmm.
getting reviewed, getting that publicity for Black women writers.
Mm-hmm.
That is perhaps a more willing engagement with a capitalist marketplace than Michelle Wallace was interested in
Mm.
seeking out in the late 70s. That's part one. I think part two, Wallace, as always, with her mother being the brilliant artist, Faith Ringgold, Michelle Wallace was very involved in advocacy for Black women visual artists and had
Mm.
founded a group focused particularly on that. That really wasn't the Sisterhood's focus, right? They're focused more on the word than the image.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, and Michelle Wallace was also participating more in a few interracial feminist collaborative groups,
Mm.
which the
Mm-hmm.
Sisterhood was not interested in interracial collaboration. I mean, most of
Right.
them were the only Black woman at any of their workplaces. Part of the point of the Sisterhood was to be an all Black, all woman space that was a respite
Mm-hmm.
and a refuge from those work. So, Michelle Wallace, I think, supported the goals of the Sisterhood and was a major and important interlocutor for them, but not a regularly attending member. Now, that said, what you can go see at the Schomburg is, whether it's a National Black Feminist Organization meeting, whether it's a consciousness raising interracial feminist group, Michelle Wallace has a piece of paper or has the program and is making notes about everything that happened, and those are all in her papers at the Schomburg.
Mm-hmm.
So that is invaluable. in terms of knowing who was where, when, saying what. And also Wallace having this kind of keen outside observer mode makes her a really good source of information. I mean,
I see.
yeah. And so that was one of the most valuable things at the Schomburg. Now, subsequent to the publication of my book, not because of my work, but just since my book came out, the poet Patricia Spears Jones has now placed her papers at the Schomburg
At the
Center for
Schomburg.
Research. Yes. So
Wow.
newly, you can now go do, which, I mean, this is all very
Heavy,
important.
heavy. Thank you
Yes.
for saying that. We
Of
see
course.
that's what we need, Courtney. We need all of that, all of those markers of, because she's New York State poet now.
That's right. New York State Poet Laureate. Yes.
Yes, poet laureate. That's that's huge. It's very important. And now it's, her work is fantastic and has been for years, but now she is truly stamped. I mean, when you're talking about putting your papers at the Schomburg and the New York Public Library, I mean, that is very much leaving, the body of your work, at least some of it, for generations that are coming behind you, and for students and scholars who really, need to know about your how you laid your marker and how you made your legacy.
That's right. And also that sometimes you failed and it wasn't easy, but you kept on going, right?
Right.
I think that's important for young writer, scholars, activists to know too. And of course, this generation of Black women, writer, scholar, activist, teachers, in the late 70s and early 80s, I mean, this is among one of our last generations to have much of a paper archive.
Yeah.
So if you think about,
because
even
everything
email,
is digital. Everything is digital. I mean, okay, I won't say everything, but what I'm talking about, our generation of the students that I'm teaching and working with, they, they didn't have to comb through, library stacks of books or magazines or printed journals to, do research papers. Everything is, going to the databases now and going to Google.
And not everything is, right? So that's
right. Not everything, but I mean, I'm speaking from their perspective. Like,
correct.
If they had to tell you, well, how do you research? They're going to say, oh, well, Professor Fraser has us using, the A to Z database, and this, it's digital. Right. So it's all digital for them as far as they're concerned. But for us, no, it was different.
Right. And it's, of course, what is available digitally is subject to the same racism, sexism, homophobia, economic disparities that have affected what is available in paper archives at libraries around the country. Right?
I appreciate you saying that, Courtney, that it's speaking the truth and saying it how it is. Yeah.
I think one of the kind of thrilling things about the group, the Sisterhood, is that many of them knew before, during, and after this group met, many of them understood that their records were important. So, I think of Alice Walker, who, happy recent 80th birthday, just turned 80 recently.
That's right.
I want to celebrate that Alice Walker knew from a very young age that that her records were worth saving. So she, saved much of her writing in her youth. Down to even saving in the 80s, the little cassette tapes that were in her answer machine. So if Toni Morrison would call and leave her a phone message,
and leave her a message,
recording exists. Right. So Walker organized all her own stuff. So before she deposited her archive at Emory University, and I think that's around 2009, she had kind of organized everything according to her system of organization, and Emory preserved that organization. So Walker was her own archivist from the jump.
Wow.
Now, not every woman writer, and certainly not every Black woman writer, thinks that about themselves. I always think about Anne Spencer, who is one of my favorite Harlem Renaissance poets. when the Yale's Beinecke Library started going around in the mid 20th century trying to collect all this Harlem Renaissance stuff from the 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Anne Spencer, the poet, writes a letter to Langston Hughes saying, in effect, well, I had no idea all the men were saving copies of your letters and blogs, so I
Wow.
threw away all my stuff.
Oh my
Right? I
goodness.
mean, it's mind blowing, right? And of course,
Wow.
Langston Hughes,
How did the men know to do that?
well, because
Because
everything about our world tells men that what they do is
it's
important in the moment,
valuable and
right?
important. Yeah.
So, I think the kind of
Mm.
radicalism of Alice Walker understanding her archive was important. But then, too, in February 1977, when the Sisterhood has their first meeting at June
Mm-hmm.
Jordan's apartment, invited by June Jordan, Alice Walker, they decide on the spot to call themselves a sisterhood. They take minutes of the first meeting. They
Wow.
capitalize. They always capitalize
Let me
the
just say to you,
sisterhood.
and Courtney, thank you. And I have to go ahead and pause and give a moment for this has been, and you mentioned women's work, but in thinking about Black women, we know the burdens historically that have happened, and just the striving for not only equality, but just to be seen, just to be visible, and to be respected and valued and heard. And to hear that these women come together and they're having meeting minutes, and that tells me these women they're doing what I know to be as Black women taking care of business.
Hmm.
Okay. And some would say, well, women taking care of business. But when I think of Black women, like it's that whole, you know what? I'll do it. There's no one
Hmm.
else around to do it. I'll do it. That whole, it's Harriet Tubman and it's Sojourner Truth. And, that legacy of women that says it's upon me to save my race, to save my community. And I feel like that thread is here, you know?
I think that that thread is here, and also I think it was really important for these women to get together in a space where there were only other Black women writers,
Mm-hmm.
where they could admit how hard that is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Courtney, please tell me what this was like for you. We talked about your research with Schomburg, and can you talk about what this process was like for you? I always consider writing to be a spiritual act. Um, and especially when you're dealing with subject matter that could possibly be touching you, reaching you in some way. Can you speak about your own process and growth, or how this affected you, and maybe even gave you a particular outlook or perspective? Your book says how Black women writers changed American culture. Does
Mhm.
your outlook on present day American culture change from what you know about what these women did and went through?
Yeah. So thank you. There's so much there.
I'm sorry, there was a lot
Don't
there, but
be, don't be.
I was trying to get to the words to really the
Mhm.
crux of it. If you let me restate it. Courtney, in your process of working on this book to now it being finished, and we know the culture we're in now. You see
Mhm.
the news, you see the things going on, whether political or whether in arts and entertainment, in
Mhm.
society, across groups and within our communities. And now knowing what you know about what these women set forth to do, does it change for you how you look at what goes on in our society now? I think that's what I'm
Mhm.
asking.
Yeah, I mean, let me say something granular about my process,
Okay,
something general about my experience, and then what I kind of think is like my takeaway lesson about how to approach the world we're in right
sure.
now. So, the cool thing about being a professor and a teacher and a writer is that we constantly have to learn new things.
Mm-hmm.
So, I just want to say, in terms of process, I had to keep doing stuff I was afraid of. Like,
Mm.
did a bunch of research interviews with living members of the Sisterhood for this book. I am not an oral historian. I am not a
Wow.
journalist. I didn't even like know what app to use, and I'm calling my journalist friends and like saying, "Help me, how do I write good questions?"
Right,
Right? Like,
right.
I mean, and this is at this point, like I'm a tenured professor who's already had a book out for a while and teaching hundreds of students a year. It's not like I am new to research,
You
but
weren't
I'm
exactly, you
learning.
weren't new to this.
Right.
Exactly.
But it was new, scary, exciting skills. And I was really fortunate that the first interview that I did in my research interviews for this book was with Margot Jefferson,
Mm,
who
mm-hmm.
really, author of two incredible, brilliant experimental memoirs and
Mm-hmm.
author of a book on Michael Jackson, but who in the 70s was storming barricades as a Black woman book critic at Newsweek.
Mm.
Um, but Margot has interviewed a lot of people in her life, and she was patient and supportive. I probably asked in a weird and awkward way. Probably
Mm-hmm.
some of my questions were not so good, but she like hung in with me. And so, in addition to allowing me to conduct a research interview, really taught me how to do it
Mm-hmm.
in that process. So one thing just I would say that I learned about process was
Mm-hmm.
willingness to do things I'm afraid of as a writer
Mm.
and a
Okay.
researcher.
Sure.
I mean, I also will say what you said about like, yeah, there's some tough stuff in this book. You uncover tough stories. Reading in Ntozake Shange's journal about her experience of, what she experienced as hatred from Black men at
Mm-hmm.
an HBCU where she staged for Color Girls. Yeah, there's a lot of pain there, right?
Yeah.
Writing through and about those things. Also, it is the case that this generation of women made it possible for me to be a person who has devoted my professional life to the study and teaching of African American literature. And as a
Mm.
white woman, it is literally the least I could do.
Mm.
Like
Wow.
to sit with those stories is
Mm.
literally the least I could do.
And I want to, Courtney, if you can just pause just for a second. And I want to thank you for your work. And I want to just, virtual hugs for your work and for your intentionality and your appreciation of what these Black women writers and intellectuals and geniuses did during a time when they were not being wholly embraced in society. And for you to bring forth this work, I mean, essentially, you brought this forth through yourself. While there may be other forces at play,
Mm-hmm.
that how people say,
Yes.
well, I was getting a nudge here and then I saw a sign
Right.
here. And it sounds, as you mentioned, your first book, there's a connection there. It was almost like, I mean, do you feel that you were being told, hey, Courtney, there's more for you? Here's part 2. Let's go a little deeper into this work.
Yes. And also, this is my lane. Like
Mm,
when, and this is not comparing me to Toni Morrison. I want to be clear.
sure.
This is just,
Mm-hmm.
Toni Morrison had some pieces of wisdom I find really useful. One of
Mm-hmm.
them is when people would ask her, how does she get it all done? She would say, I no longer throw dinner parties. I take that to heart. The second,
Mm.
the second one is,
The dinner parties went out the window.
yeah,
We got
exactly.
it. We got some serious work to do.
Right. But she also, during her years as an editor at Random House, and I urge people to keep an eye out for Dana Williams' forthcoming book about this, Toni at Random.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Dana Williams. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so keep an eye out for Dana's book next year.
Oh
But
wow, that's going to be
yeah,
amazing.
yes, it is. But when Morrison is working as an editor at Random House, she starts around 65 to 67, and she's there. The dates when she left, I think, are contested because she kind of would jump in and edit when there was an important Black writer like Toni Cade
Mm-hmm.
Bambara, whose work she wanted to edit. She would continue on to do that after she was not at Random House full time. But anyhow,
Sure.
she would say, in in persuading Angela Davis to write her autobiography, and in Morrison editing and publishing it and publicizing it, and persuading Muhammad Ali to write his autobiography, and putting together the Black Book in 74, Gail Jones's Corregidora, 75, both Bambara's books of short stories, and so on. Morrison was very clear about, her work was not about direct political action or protest. Her work was not about marching in the streets. Her work was about helping people get down on the page, that record of a complex, like, Black life. I mean, my work is really as a teacher, and this book is really just an extension of me as a teacher, right? Like, my lane is books, and so the first. So yeah,
I
was
get it,
like,
and because everyone actually has their own activism, their own ministry or purpose, and it could be all kind of, solving the same issue or meeting the same need. It's just different lanes, different pathways, right?
Right.
Do you think?
I mean, you're doing work with your podcast, with your poetry, with your nonfiction, right? Right. I mean, so yes. But I think that is a good place to take us into how did this research affect what I see in terms of our moment in the world. Which is,
yes, you've said it. Thank you, Courtney.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I have learned from studying the women of the Sisterhood, what I think it's really important to think back to these moments. I mean, and this really stretches from the student activism movement of the late 1960s, where, Shange and Thulani Davis sat in at Barnard College together. Audre Lorde was bringing blankets and soup to kids at City College who were sitting in. And this is to protest militaristic policies and sexist policies and advocate for Black, ethnic, and women's studies, right? So from that moment, until I think some point in the 1980s and during the rise of the Reagan right, let's say, there's this window where Black women writers, intellectuals, activists, artists, folks really expected that college tuition was going to be free for anyone who wanted it. Folks really expected that there was going to be free childcare for every kid under 5 in this country. People really thought that the United States would treat healthcare as a human right. Our undergraduate students in college right now, taking on unsurmountable debt to get an education, cannot even imagine a reality in which college tuition would be free. Cannot even imagine a reality in which the kids that they're leaving with babysitters so they can go take their college classes would have childcare, right? So, I mean, I increasingly think that the thing we do with fiction and poetry and plays in the class, for me as a teacher and scholar of Black women's literature, is to remind my students to have a radical imagination, to have what Robin Kelley describes as freedom dreams. And their freedom dreams should include those things that Black women, in the 60s and 70s, like, actually thought were inevitable, that young people today are really struggling to imagine. And so I think it's about opening the possibility of radical imagination for young people for all the things they might go on to do, whether that's be a librarian or a parent or a bank manager or whatever. They're going to be better and more just in those ways in the world for having read books by Black women, no matter what.
Yeah, that's so important. And Courtney, do you feel that the legacy of, because as you mentioned, you were able to do some meaningful interviews with living members of the Sisterhood. Do you feel that in this day and age, even in academia, have the members who've gone on, such as, who have passed, such as June Jordan and Audre Lorde, these great, giant Black women womanists. I know some may say feminists. I guess I might say womanists. These women who were leading intellectual thinkers and creators of their time, Ntozake Shange. Do you feel that they have been revered enough, that there are enough works, whether in film or print books or even, digital media podcasting, that have geared toward promoting their voices today?
Well, I mean, not even close. And I wouldn't say even so much that there's not enough work that elevates or reveres these Black women writers and thinkers, and I think womanist is a totally accurate term. I would say there's not enough material out there, whether audio, digital, visual, or print, that demonstrates that we've learned the lessons that these women had to offer or read them deeply enough. I mean, for me, it seems to be that people only talk about June Jordan with some regularity, even in the past 5 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I can also clearly see that there are plenty of people who are talking and thinking about June Jordan right now without attending to, and I can even be guilty of this to some degree, without attending to, with June Jordan and Audre Lorde both, their deep commitment to and understanding of Black American women as authorities on international matters and U.S. foreign policy, right? I mean, you had Lorde writing about Grenada, you had June Jordan publishing, in essence, thanks to the Sisterhood's advocacy about U.S. interventions in Nicaragua, right? And that June Jordan had a lifelong commitment to a free Palestine. So in this moment, I see that our readings of her notions of Black freedom maybe don't account for her commitment to many other freedoms, right? So like we haven't even read or thought deeply enough or put to work what we've learned from these writers. I mean, much less, I think that, Verda May Grosvenor had come to get more of her due by the time of her passing. She earned a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Foodways Alliance and a number of other things. But, when I talked to Verda May Grosvenor, not too long before, maybe a year or so before her passing, she is an example of someone this is one of our most important and also clever, savvy, fun Black women writers, right? Author of Vibration Cooking or Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl from 1970. And which is a kind of cookbook memoir travelogue, and also the 72 book Thursdays and Every Other Sunday Off, a domestic rap, which is a witty and trenchant commentary of Black women's work in domestic service, as she puts it, for a span of over 300 years, right? Verda May Grosvenor is a hugely important voice who I think folks have just begun to understand her importance, mostly after her passing. Now, when I spoke to her before her passing, basically a series of moves and hurricanes, she lived largely in or adjacent to Sea Islands and Savannah.
Okay.
She lost her entire archive.
Wow.
So I'm sending her in, I think 2014 or 15, I'm sending her DVDs of her own PBS
her work.
Show. Of her own PBS, Verda May Cooks in America's Family Kitchen, which was a wildly successful show in its day for PBS, right? She just didn't even have any way to look back at all. She
didn't have a way to get to it, right?
I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and Verda May also appeared in the film version of Morrison's Beloved and in Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, she's, so that's just one kind of example of a figure whom maybe we don't grasp the importance of.
Sure.
There's more to be done.
and there's so much more to be done. Just a few tidbits here that I did make note of. I love the mention of, because I think oftentimes we talk about African American literature, sometimes, and I don't mean you, but maybe, whether it's in the classroom or just in discussion with others, we talk about diaspora. There is, our Caribbean writers, and you mention in your book that the sisterhood created that connection and bridge from the U.S. to the Caribbean. I wonder
That's
if you
right.
can speak on that. It makes me think about some of my favorite writers as Caribbean poets and writers, Jamaica Kincaid, and you've
Mm-hmm.
got just so many poets, Claude McKay, Harlem Renaissance poet, was originally from the Caribbean. That link is heavy, but sometimes we don't always discuss it. So I wonder if you could speak to a bit of that on how they bridge, since you mentioned the international contributions and the way these women were so forward thinking. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, Paule Marshall was an important member of the sisterhood who attended most of the meetings, and she was older than some of the other members in the group. So Barbadian American, first generation born in this country with strong ties to Barbados, and Barbados, plays an important role in Paule Marshall's fiction. One thing actually the sisterhood did together was help bring Marshall's 1959 novel Brown Girl Brownstones with a new foreword by Mary Helen Washington back into print. And that's a book about a Barbadian American neighborhood in Brooklyn, right? It's about a Caribbean immigrant experience. So I'm trying to find something better than elder stateswoman as a way to describe
Sure. No, I understand. It's
she was a kind of she had cultural capital. She had a few books out. She had been in the Harlem Writers Guild and other organizations. She was established.
But stateswoman is perfect, because if we were talking about a man, they say a statesman.
Right. That's fair.
What did they say that about Langston Hughes? Sometimes they even refer to him as Sir Langston Hughes.
No, that's right. It's not stateswoman that I think Paule Marshall would have objected to, but I don't like using the word older or
elder term, right?
Yeah, so I'm treading cautiously there.
Yeah.
And it's also true that one of the most the older, more established women in the group was Laurie Sharp, who appears in the famous photo, and she was a Caribbean American woman, single mother of 2 daughters, and more of a political activist. So she famously wrote for feminist consciousness raising groups the Black Women's Supplemental Guidelines. Like, she's basically taking white feminists to task for not addressing Black feminism in this period.
Sure.
And so she had that kind of that Caribbean connection, as well as did scholar Veve Clark, who was in the group, and many others. So this idea that a connection to, and Audre Lorde's maternal connections to Grenada. So the idea that a connection to the Caribbean was an undercurrent of the group is really central.
Sure.
Now, and informed their interest in their own international reach. So that would include, like, Paule Marshall attends Festac in Lagos, Nigeria in 1977. And it's a, international celebration of Black arts and culture. And Marshall comes back to the sisterhood and gives a presentation with slides on Festac at a sisterhood meeting, right? At the same time, there are other members who travel. Alice Walker travels to Cuba, both a kind of secret and unsanctioned trip, and then as an official, years later, delegation of writers. But she's also going to Cuba and coming back and reporting on her experience in Cuba. Toni Cade Bambara goes with a group of women writers of color, and she would have identified this as third world women writers, right? And a lot, which meant some third world women's feminism, has a specific meaning in this context. Bambara is traveling to Vietnam and helping women in Vietnam during the Vietnam War be getting letters back and forth from family in the United States, right? So that kind of international agency and knowledge and sort of capacity to think of oneself not just as part of the Black diaspora, but as in alliance with other oppressed women of color around the world, really important to
Mm-hmm.
really
And
important to
I
their
was going to
thought.
say, and you do, as I'm looking through the book here, on page 78, you do mention about Audre Lorde. Her place in politics necessitated solidarity with oppressed Black and Latinx people globally.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so you make quite a few of those connections, not few, a great deal of those connections. That, in other words, it wasn't just about what's going on in New York City or the Bay Area or DC. These women were thinking globally. What are the lives of women and oppressed Black and brown people experiencing and going through the world over?
That's
And
right.
yeah.
And also that their experience as Black American women in New York City gave them plenty of expertise and knowledge to be able to think globally.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, as June Jordan was at the this was her Brooklyn apartment. But what's interesting, Courtney? I still think of, even though I know of Shange, I always saw her as a traveler, from New York and the
Mm-hmm.
Bay Area. And of course, she taught in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at June Jordan as a poet who was in the Bay Area as well. Am I mistaken that June Jordan was on the West Coast for quite a bit of time? So how was it that both June Jordan and Ntozake Shange spent time in California? And I wanted to ask you if you knew that this time period was in the midst of them, probably before they kind of transitioned out west, or
Mm-hmm.
after, or during. Like, how did being in New York play that a part? Because I always think of them as women who did quite a bit of arts work, with the Poetry for the People, with
Yes.
June
Yes.
Jordan. I really always thought that was rooted in California. Am I wrong about that?
No,
Or okay.
Poetry for the People was June Jordan's project at UC Berkeley, which really was at its apex, I think, late 80s and early 90s. And Poetry
Okay.
for the People still exists to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And um, Jordan was among those who would move west, Alice Walker too,
Mm-hmm.
after the height of the Sisterhood. But this
Mm-hmm.
period in 77, when they start to get together, yeah, I mean, New York matters immensely for a
Yeah.
whole bunch of reasons. Like,
Yeah.
it's the center of the publishing world. It's densely populated with,
Theater and plays for colored girls. I know that
hmm
Shange for colored girls did appear, not appear, but it was staged, um, in New York City, and she received a lot of acclaim for that. I want to say
exactly.
in the early 70s.
Well,
Um,
so in 70, when the Sisterhood starts meeting in 77, now
mhm.
Shange's for Color Girls has moved to Broadway just in 76, just months before.
Just
And
months before.
and in fact, at that point, there are posters. Multiple members of the Sisterhood told me this. There are posters all over New York City for Color Girls, and the picture is not of the cast; it is of Ntozake Shange's face,
Right.
larger than life, all over the city. Right.
Sure.
So she's almost like the face of
So
Black
she's
women's
the first,
creativity in New York.
right, right, yeah. And
Um,
it's that, and I know it's that one. It has to, and you tell me, it's that one where we see where it almost looks like her brow is furrowed a little bit.
yes,
It's
yes,
that famous image of her,
right.
that's been everywhere, where she really does look like, yeah, the weight of the world is on this color girl's shoulders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. So, I mean, that aspect of New York, it's this moment of Shange everywhere in the, her face is everywhere in the city. For Colored Girls is on Broadway. Of course, Morrison is now 10 years into a career at Random House, which is also based in the city. But then you have, many of these women, Patricia Spears Jones, Michelle Wallace, others writing for the Village Voice. You have Margot Jefferson, and to some extent Michelle Wallace and Judith Wilson doing work at Newsweek, writing in Time and elsewhere. So the centrality, the density of mass market magazines is also important, and mass market trade publishing. So all of that. Um, and this is June. They also, many of the women had met or were initially connected by the Sikh program in the City College of New York in the 60s. So, Sikh is the search for education, elevation, and knowledge. This is a program started in the CUNY system in the early to mid 1960s. And Sisterhood members, Jessica Harris, a foodways writer and
Oh yeah,
memoirist,
Jessica
and
B.
yeah,
Harris of High on the
yes,
Hog. Oh
yes,
yes,
that's
I
right,
love
that's
Jessica
right.
B. Harris.
So
I've watched both seasons of High on the Hog. She is amazing what she does with culinary
so good.
history, food history of Black folks, and tracing
Mm,
all the way back to Africa and the South. Yes, I love it. Thank you for
that's right.
mentioning.
Of course. So
Dr. Harris, yes.
yeah. So Dr. Harris did attend a couple meetings of the Sisterhood. Um,
Wow.
yep.
Oh
And
my gosh.
she is yes, and
This
she
is
is one of
blowing my mind, Courtney. This is
it's
just like
incredible. But she's one of the, and she's still a emerita at believe now at Queens College. But her
okay.
experience in the New York City in the CUNY school system started with Sikh. So it's June
Mm.
Jordan is teaching in Sikh, Toni Morrison is teaching Toni Cade Bambara. The major important
Wow.
white poet ally Adrienne Rich also teaches in Sikh.
Uh-huh.
And the idea of Sikh was more um, to get the population of New York City colleges to
Yeah.
look more like the population of New York
More
City,
diverse. To look
basically.
like New York
Right.
City. Yes.
Exactly. And to, I mean, this is the language of the Sikh program, help students whose high schools had not prepared them for college. And I am a
Sure.
little ambivalent about, some of the kind of ways that we just like manage to not refer to race by saying
Yeah.
language like that. But anyway, as these kind of programs go, it's maybe very well intentioned, but not necessarily super well funded or
Mm-hmm.
scaffolded. So
Sure.
it's like Ntozake Shange, Bambara, Jordan Rich, whoever are calling each other up, being like, "So what are you teaching in your class? And what does your syllabus look like? And can you send me so they're really
Oh, I
collaborating
love
to
that.
create these courses, right?
Wow. These women
And
were serious. I mean,
right,
yeah.
right. So that was a New York specific
Mm.
moment that
Okay.
brought many of them together. And even through just like commuting every day on the
Mm-hmm.
subway together to teach their classes, established some of the bonds and some of the groundedness in New York that would matter for the sisterhood happening there. And just to answer the question about Jordan, I mean, she also earned the rank of full professor at SUNY
Mm.
before heading west
Oh,
to
before she
Berkeley.
had, wow, that is crazy.
Yeah. And Veve Clark, the scholar Veve Clark, was
Uh-huh.
based at Berkeley, but the sisterhood was so important to her that she flew back to New York once a month to attend meetings.
Wow. These women were
So,
so I mean, I just cannot. I mean, are you kidding me? And not to mention, oh, she was able to fly back just every month.
right,
Just
right.
that's something. That means, everything was on point for her. The money was flowing and
Yes.
everything. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, so
that's
Veve Clark,
fantastic.
Veve Clark and June Jordan both reached the rank of full professor at Berkeley.
Well,
So that's a big
they had
deal.
to have been fairly young, June Jordan. If she had reached, did you say she reached the rank of full professor at CUNY?
At SUNY, at State University of
SUNY.
New York.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's a state university. She had to have been fairly young. Would you say probably in her 30s or early 30s or?
I don't know. I can't
Gosh,
right
and are you
this moment I
saying,
can't pin down
right.
the
Are you
arc.
saying this was in the 70s?
Yeah, this was in I can check.
Wow.
Would be, and it would probably be in the early 80s.
Early
Um
80s. Okay,
and
so it
it's
was,
in the
okay.
80s that these women really start to move into academia. Not all of them
Right,
do,
right.
but it is in the 1980s that they start to put their um huge and significant talent largely into colleges and universities,
That's amazing.
partly,
Oh, yes.
yeah, because it's sustainable, right? I mean, there's
Right.
lots of problems with higher education and it's complicated, and they had to be, sometimes complicit in things that they didn't necessarily want to, but this generation of women, the sisterhood and their broader network, are the ones who
Mm-hmm.
regularized the study of African American literature,
Mm-hmm.
brought Black women's writing into the academy, and built and sustained Black studies for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, colleges and universities are big and slow moving, and there are ways that's really good because it institutionalizes some of these things, right? In a
Right.
way that, like, even just to get my hands on the brilliant art historian Sisterhood member Judith Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
you know, she wrote in essence about a wide variety of Black women visual arts,
Mm.
including artists, including Lorraine O'Grady. You know, so
Mm-hmm.
Wilson is writing about Lorraine O'Grady in essence fully 40 years before the rest of the world decides that Lorraine O'Grady is important and should
Is
have a
of
written
value.
perspective at the Brooklyn Museum and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it was really, really hard to get my hands on any kind of copy of Judith Wilson's writings of
Wow.
essence. I mean, I'm talking about stuff from 1981. You know what I mean? Like, I'm a lot older than
Mm.
these things are. Like, and I
Right.
can't get a copy of it, you know?
Right.
Um, so so it's just that goes back, I guess, to that question of value in archive, but it
Mm-hmm.
also goes to um, them understanding, and Judith Wilson did go this route, that writing sometimes academic or scholarly works meant that they would have duration, like that they
Mm-hmm.
would remain available.
Sure.
And then, you know, also, of course, like, we can't really see the teaching, but that's something that had some of their greatest impacts, right?
Sure.
Teaching many, many classes. And Jordan's Poetry for the People, which you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
did produce a book, Blueprint for Poetry for the People, which is
Mm-hmm.
amazing. And it's just like straight up worksheets. If you want to organize a poetry reading, here's some
Here's how
ideas
you
of how
do
to
it.
do it. It's great. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing. Courtney, this is just phenomenal, and I want to also take my hat off to you. I see that you have been doing a number of various speaking engagements, and you know your book is really making its rounds. And so I want to hear about what's coming up next. But before that, Courtney, can you please treat us to a brief excerpt reading from the Sisterhood? Any section that you'd like to go with? I'd be most happy to hear.
Yeah, I'm going to read a little bit from the bottom of page 86,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that you and your listeners care about poetry. And I
Yes,
think that this fits with some of what
we
you,
love poetry.
yes, and I think that this fits with some of what we've been talking about.
Oh yes, thank you.
Yeah, so
Okay.
um, it's June Jordan's poem, Letter to My Friend, the Poet Ntozake Shange, gives us a sense of how much work it took to get together, stay in touch, and keep the sisterhood going. Jordan wrote Letter to My Friend during the Sisterhood's most active period, and the poem appeared in her volume Passion, New Poems in 1980. With a tone of both frustration and love, this poem depicts the difficulty of maintaining relationships amid the demands of housework, travel, and career. So this is June Jordan's poem, Letter to My Friend, the Poet Ntozake Shange. Just back from Minnesota, North Dakota, all my clothes into the laundry or dry cleaners before I leave again for Oregon, then California. And my agent calls to say your business manager is sending me a Christmas present from you by messenger within the next 2 hours. Will I be home? Jesus Christ, I think, getting nervous about 2 hours housebound under the circumstances. Maybe one of us better slow down. This speaker is in between trips, likely to give public poetry readings in Minnesota, North Dakota, and then Oregon, then California. She's in demand enough to have readings, gigs, and an agent, but not so economically flush that there's anyone else but herself to deal with housework, with that laundry or dry cleaners. with clothes to wash before she hits the road again, the speakers perhaps running back and forth between her New York apartment and a washer-dryer in the basement or a laundromat down the block, in addition to dropping clothes off at the dry cleaners. Between this and her other errands, she is getting nervous about the idea of 2 hours housebound, waiting for a package to be delivered. Letter to my friend, the poet Ntozake Shange, stays in present tense, building urgency and this nervous feeling. The Jordan figure in the poem gets a call from her agent with news that the Shange figure's business manager says a Christmas present is on the way by messenger. It is absurd that these two friends, who had, for years, often spoken on the phone, hung out, and written letters to each other, find their relationship mediated by people who work for them as they each became busy in ways that required this kind of help. The speaker exclaims, Jesus Christ, silently to herself at the ridiculous notion that a Christmas gift between poets requires a staff. This poem describes the lives of members of the Sisterhood, but the title invites us to read it as correspondence from Jordan to Shange, meant for a public readership. Letter to my friend, the poet Ntozake Shange, is an act of mediation and representation for public consumption, not a private letter between friends, but a published work that names the two women as poets, my friend the poet Ntozake Shange, though both were writing across genres. This poem represents not just intimate griping among friends about housework and travel, but also how domestic and poetic labor are intertwined, interdependent, and demanding in ways that put pressure on personal relationships. The speaker cautions, quote, maybe one of us better slow down, but makes it clear that neither of them will. Sisterhood members managing the demands of family, home, teaching, writing, activism, and for some, increasing visibility in the literary marketplace, could surely see themselves in Jordan's depiction. It was hard work and a real accomplishment to gather once a month for substantive conversation and collaborative work. The speaker has the success that the Sisterhood wanted, especially for its poets, and that success is hard to navigate. While describing these challenges, Letter to my friend, the poet Ntozake Shange, also declares in public that Black women writers are in demand. They have agents and business managers and are traveling around the country to give readings.
Brava. Wow.
Oh, thank you.
That's amazing. I love that.
I thought that tied to our chat.
She could have just said the letter to my friend, Ntozake Shange, but instead she inserts letter to my friend the poet.
That's right.
It's really signaling, as you mentioned, we have arrived. She has arrived.
That's right.
But we're kind of, missing each other here amidst all of our, new fame.
And it's hard to arrive. It's great to have arrived, but it's hard too, especially for Black women. Visibility is complicated.
Yeah. And I can see that, but I the love between these women and just the dedication and commitment they had to seeing each other thrive is just beautiful. And I really get that from your work. They were so intentional. They could have, each of these women said, you know what, I'm just concerned about me and mine. I got my book deal. I got my play on Broadway. I got this. But they were about community, no matter what, no matter how far they rose up. That's what really strikes me.
It's one of the big lessons, I hope, of this book.
Yeah.
That anything worth doing isn't done alone.
Wow, that's so powerful. Yes. Courtney, thank you for that reading and that excerpt. And please, so again, for our listeners, let me just state the title again. I'm speaking with Courtney Thorsson, the author of The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Changed American Culture, published, newly out as of, Courtney, was it this past month, right at the new year? December?
It was at the very end. It was late 2023.
Late 2023. Yeah. Okay. It feels, yes, very much like a New Year's present, Okay. And so, Courtney, please tell us, what do you have planned for your book? What's coming up for you? And what are you really excited about?
I feel really lucky and grateful that I get to be out there having conversations with, like this one, with people like you who are reading
Yay.
and carefully thinking about this work. And I'm down to continue to do that. So, I have I'll be at the Virginia Festival of the Book
Mm-hmm.
March 21st, where I get to be on a panel with the historian Ethel Morgan Smith, who writes about women in the civil rights movement, her book Path to Grace. So
Mm.
that's kind of in the immediate, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to continue to share this work with all kinds of folks for whom it's useful, right? Which, I hope is a broad swath of people. I am very happy to report that I have been newly approved to be on sabbatical next year. Yeah, so
Yay.
which is to say, like, I'm just a regular English professor.
But
Like, I
that's
teach many courses.
huge.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So what that means is I'm still doing all my regular job every day, right? And my
Uh-huh.
teaching and my service and all that stuff. So the time next year is going to give me on sabbatical is going to give me that precious time to sit with a bunch of other writing I've done, pull it together, and see what's useful there.
Okay.
So I'm really interested in formally experimental Black
Mm-hmm.
writing, kind of in the post-civil rights movement era,
Mm-hmm.
that traces or kind of reemerges these key moments of state sanctioned and state enacted violence. So, I have a piece about the presence of the Atlanta child murders in African American literature that came out a
Mm-hmm.
few years ago. And so that's about those Atlanta child murders of 79 to 81, and writing by James Baldwin, Tayari Jones, and Toni Cade Bambara. Now,
Mm.
there's similar work to be done around the way the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia in 1985 crops up in John Edgar Wideman's Philadelphia
Oh
Fire,
yeah.
Lucille Clifton's
Mm-hmm.
poem Move, and also writings by Joseph Beam, who I think is, queer Black American writer who is very understudied.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's work to be done around Rodney King, in Rodney King's place in African American literature in the same way. So I don't really know
Mm-hmm.
if I have anything useful there, but that's the stuff that I have a bunch of writing about. And I'm
Sure.
gonna spread it all around me on the floor sometime when
And see,
sabbatical
right. And
begins
then
and see what
see
I
what,
got.
listen for those nudges and the whole, I just feel like you were really guided in so many ways, Courtney. It sounds like this was definitely no accident, and you took up the task. And so, thank you for your work. It's a beautiful book, and I just look forward to seeing all of what you're going to be, putting together, and just everything that comes from this book, because now it's out, and then it can have, a new life on its own, with the rest of us reacting and in conversation with you about it.
Yeah, I feel really just fortunate, and I'm so grateful that it's being well received, taken up, and put to work by all kinds of thinkers.
Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful. And Courtney, please tell us where we can follow you, how we can pick up the book. People listening, as I do the virtual promotions, how can people best pick up a copy of the book? How can they, continue to follow you and watch everything that you're doing?
My book, The Sisterhood, is available wherever books are sold, but I encourage you to use bookshop.org to order from your favorite local independent bookstore. Um, you can find me on Twitter, or now X, at C_Thorson, or on Instagram at Courtney Thorsson. That's Thorson with two S's. My very amateur personal website is CourtneyThorsson.com. And otherwise, you can find me in the classroom at the University of Oregon.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. And Courtney, you definitely have a lot of great things going for you right now. And I thank you so much for joining me on Nerdacity podcast. And I wish you all the best, and stay tuned for this episode. And I look forward to being in touch with you.
That sounds great. I appreciate you, DuEwa, the work, this conversation, but also the work you're doing in general in the world.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and best wishes to you.
You too.